In 2002, Alex Matter, the son of Bert Matter, the photographer, went to his father's attic and found a box full of 32 paintings, painted in the style of Jackson Pollock. Now, considering the friendship between Jackson Pollock and the Matter family, he automatically deduced that these had been painted and produced by Jackson Pollock. When he entrusted James Martin, the forensic scientist, at analyzing 24 of these paintings, sadly, they were found to be inauthentic. In 2004, Domenico Di Sol and Eleonora, his wife, decided to buy this painting. They were convinced by, at the time, the very famous Knoedler Gallery. They paid $8.3 million for that painting. And they were very happy to have this abstract expressionist painter gracing their walls. However, in 2011, Domenico Di Sol was very worried because he got to know that a Jackson Pollock sold by the same gallery had been shown to be a forgery, and what worried him was that the provenance of this particular painting had the exact provenance as his Rothko. So he didn't lose any time, and he went to James Martin again, and sadly, this painting proved to be a forgery. Now, this, of course, is a drop in the ocean of the hundreds of forgeries flooding the art market today. And as actually pointed out by an anonymous observer, it's a stark reality that artworks are increasingly viewed as commodities, a captivating avenue for investment and a means to mitigate tax obligations. This shift in perception has led to a surge in prices, transforming the art market into a breeding ground for forgeries and counterfeit works in paintings and sculptures. However, although today's art market is flooded with forgeries, in fact, a Metropolitan Museum curator said that 40% of all art sold are forgeries, and another said that 60% of Giacometti's are forgeries. Very worrying. However, this is not a new problem. The scale is different, but it's an old problem. And as Vermeer lamented, as long as there is art, there will be forgery. Now, if we go back in time and look at these two paintings, they look identical, strikingly so. The 1924 painting was bought in 1893 by the chemist, the industrial chemist Ludwig Mond, and was donated to the, when he died in 1924, he donated it to the National Gallery. He had bought it from a Roman dealer. Its earliest history is unknown. And the National Gallery was very pleased to have this particular painting, again, part of its possessions. Until 1954, if we look at this one, this particular painting, which is maybe a bit brighter, appeared in another London gallery. And of course, the National Gallery, worried about its own reputation, decided immediately to analyze closely its own painting. And I just want to say one word on the National Gallery, because I think it's laudable when a museum actually recognizes that amongst its collections are certain forgeries. And in 2010, the National Gallery had made an exhibit of all the forgeries they had discovered by the laboratory. Now, when they analyzed the 1924, their own version, they found it to be a forgery. The real real 1954 was the authentic, and today is in the Carnegie Museum at Pittsburgh. Now, if we look at another of these, this particular painting, Madonna of the Veil, in 1930, Robert Fry said it looked like a Botticelli. It's a beautiful Botticelli. And it attracted the attention of Viscount Farlane, who bought it for $25,000. That would be ideal today. But then, and when he died, he donated it to the Courtauld Gallery. But then Kenneth Clark, who was director of the National Gallery at the time, he noticed something very strange. He looked at the face of the Madonna that you see up there, and he said it looks strangely like Jean Harlow, the star of the 30s. And that triggered the analysis by the labs of this particular painting, which again proved to be a forgery. And so having introduced you to this spectrum, old and new, of forgeries, let us move forward and look at what really is entailed in authenticating a painting. Is it the role only of the scientist, or there are other key players who are important in the matter? Now, what is the role of the gallery dealer, the curator? Somebody comes and says, I have a Monet, a Manet, a Van Gogh, a Sisley, or what have you. Now, what does the gallery dealer do? What does the curator do? What the connoisseur do, and the art historian? Well, the gallery dealer and the curator are very aware of provenance. They want to know a story of ownership way back to the painter that actually painted it. And of course, this is a very difficult task, and the forgers are as creative in creating stories of provenance as they are in creating their own forgeries. But it's generally a variation of the theme that an Italian family has owned this for generations, is facing dire financial problems, and wants to sell the painting. So that is the dealer and the curator. Now, the connoisseur makes a stylistic analysis. The connoisseur looks at the painting and says, is the brushwork in keeping with the brushworks of the time? Is the brushwork in keeping with that of the artist? And also the connoisseur looks sometimes at what we call raking light, and that's much right at a certain angle, and looks at craquelure. Now, cracks are a set of cracks in the painting due to the shrinkage over time of pigments. And as we shall see, this plays a minimal role, but an important role in authentication. This is initially done with a naked eye and with a lens, but gradually it is done by a more sophisticated way. Now, the art historians brings to bear all the historical, circumstantial evidence that explain why such a piece did not appear so far on the market. Now, here is what really concerns us today, and that is the scientist and the technical analysis. Now, analysis entails several steps. The first one is the surface examination. With the optical microscope, what we have is basically looking at the surface, at the cracks, and then looking also at, with ultraviolet fluorescence, looking at the surface to see if there are any retouches, because these, as we shall see, are a bit different. The second part is the examination of the underdrawing, and, canvases are very expensive, and neither artists nor forgers can make poor use of them. And therefore, sometimes you find several paintings, one over the top of the other. Sometimes you find an underdrawing, and these actually, suppose you find an underpainting that belongs to an artist who lived after the purported artist's death. Definitely a forgery. So you will see some conditions, and there are two techniques there that I will talk about: X-ray radiography and infrared reflectography. And then finally, there's the analysis of the body, and here you have a wide spectrum of techniques. Now, I will be giving you some of the traditional ones, but I will give also some of the most sophisticated techniques that play a role also in authentication, because there's always in the mind set of the individual, or of our mindset, that you can never authenticate. You can, yes, falsify, you can find a forgery, but there are certain instances where using a specific technique, which is quite crucial in the authentication process. Now, here we have a range: X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, Raman, mass spectroscopy, etc. Because, of course, I'm told that I have to finish exactly in 60 minutes. I will not be able to cover everything, but I will give as many examples as I can. Now here, of course, you can see this particular face, which is very familiar to all of you, and that is looking at the cracks. If you look at it here at the face, you have all these cracks that are being formed. That's the craquelure. It could be looked at with the optical microscope, or even more closely with the stereo microscope, which is very much like the optical microscope, but it has two objectives, two eyepieces, and so on, so it gives better view. Now, if the cracks have a certain, actually, pattern, here in the Hamilton curve, Spike Bucklow did an excellent work on craquelure and has classified various craquelure forms that play a role in authentication. But generally, if there's a pattern, this suggests authenticity. If there's a maze of tortuous lines, and these are normally obtained by the forger is very clever because, the forger wants to accelerate the drying process. So what the forger does is heat, or treat chemically, or draw very thin, and that's a very, very laborious thing, very thin, dark lines in order to simulate craquelure, and this generally can be observed. So in that case, if you get a maze of tortuous lines, these in general indicate forgery. Now, I've spoken about also another technique of surface, which is ultraviolet. Ultraviolet light is a bit stronger than visible light, has more energy, and when it impinges on a painting, the older parts of the painting, the authentic, fluoresce under ultraviolet light. But the actual, if you look here, the actual darkness that you have there, this indicates a retouch as a first thing. Of course, there needs to be further confirmation of this. Now, in having dealt with the surface, we move to the underlayer, and one of the techniques is infrared reflectography. And here, if you look, infrared rays penetrate more easily than visible light, and depending, of course, on the thickness, they reach the underlayer, and they are reflected in a very high-resolution camera where you can see the underdrawing. And if the underdrawing is made out of graphite or carbon, it gives you very good underdrawings. And in this case, what we see is sometimes what we call pentimenti. And pentimenti is generally a change of mind on the part of the artist, and as we will see in this particular instance, here's a painting, here's the underdrawing, and here's the third one. Now, if you look, the hand is different, and of course the artist changed his mind, and this, in this case, is pentimenti, which is generally an indication of authenticity, especially in old paintings. Because now forgers have become aware that infrared reflectography exists, and so they forge also the underdrawing and make pentimenti. So in all manner of... Now, sometimes you have anachronism in skies. Look at here. This belongs to the blue period of Picasso. Picasso had blue, pink periods, and then you had Cubist, and then you had his surrealistic time. Now, if you find a Cubist under a blue period, of course, this is anachronistic with the style of Picasso. It's definitely a forgery. So all these parameters are important. Now, there is Maurizio Serafini, a very well-known forensic scientist, who pioneered this technique of multispectral imaging. Multispectral imaging actually takes one camera with many filters, so many different wavelengths, and gives different information as we go along. Now, if I look at here, this is, of course, the normal image. This is ultraviolet fluorescence that I spoke about. This is ultraviolet reflected, and this generally gives an idea about some paints that have faded with time. And then I will have infrared photography, infrared reflectography, and the infrared false color gives different mixtures of pigments. So this gives a very good idea to the analyst of the developments of the particular painting. Now, if we go back to our original painting, why or how was it discovered as a forgery? First of all, the lab, the National Gallery, noted, first of all, that here by the optical, that the cracks were painted. It was not a real craquelure. Second, by infrared reflectography, if we look here, what actually was discovered was that the underdrawing was done in much more detail than that of the artist, supposedly Francesco Francia did this particular painting. So this was ruled honestly, very honestly by the National Gallery as a forgery. Now, sometimes to complement the infrared reflectography, X-ray radiography was also a very important technique, and the X-ray here, a very rudimentary form. You have an X-ray, it falls on the painting, it's received on a film, digitized, and gives an idea about the underdrawing, which complements the information by infrared. And if we move to a forgery, this particular forgery is that of Bruegel. And the way it was found to be a forgery was that the cracks by X-ray radiography did not reach the bottom. So it's obviously chemistry galore or heating. Clever forger. Now here, we move to the third stage, and that is the body of the painting. And here, we have X-ray fluorescence, which is a totally non-destructive technique, a very simple technique, and gives very good results for the identification of inorganic pigments. And the principle of this particular technique is as follows. In an atom, you have the nucleus, and then you have about it electrons. X-ray strikes, ejects an electron, the atom becomes unstable, an electron from an upper level fills in the vacancy, and in doing so, emits an X-ray. And the X-ray that is emitted is characteristic of the element, and once you know the element, you know the pigment. Okay? But here you notice that, and you get a spectrum which looks like this. This here would suggest silver, copper, chromium, etc. My eyesight is very bad. And so in that particular case, you see energy dispersive because all the elements are analyzed at the same time because of a good now digital, or a good now detector connected to what we call a multi-channel analyzer that analyzes everything at the same time. And therefore, from the spectrum, the forensic scientist can know what the pigments are, and if there is a pigment that did not belong to the time of the artist, it's a forgery, unless there's a retouch, and there are ways of determining that. Now, if I come to our dear Madonna, yes, it was found out by X-ray fluorescence that the robe was in Prussian blue. Prussian blue is an 18th century painting, could not have been painted by Botticelli. Furthermore, further anachronistic, I mean here, of course, the forger had no idea that one day X-ray fluorescence would uncover. And all these 19th century pigments were found. But also with X-ray radiography, what was actually found was we have artificial wormholes that were done. And not only did he take the face of Jean Harlow, but he also looked at posters and saw that the lips had a dark contour, And so here it had the Donco tool, whereas Botticelli always used madder light red around. So this confirmed absolutely the forgery as such. Now, as we move forward to the body now, infrared spectroscopy, it's becoming more, the plot thickens, okay? Here, as we go along, organic compounds are formed of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, principally, and other, of course, secondary elements. But it's very difficult by X-ray fluorescence. How are you going to differentiate what pigment it is, what binding material, what organic dye? And therefore, infrared spectroscopy is being used. Now, infrared spectroscopy is basically based on the fact that if you look at an atom, a molecule, the atoms are connected by bonds. The bonds, as if they had springs, and they vibrate. And the infrared is weak, so it doesn't eject an electron, but it allows vibration. And each vibration has certain energies. This is symmetric search, asymmetric search, etc. And you get, at the end of the day, a spectrum that is a fingerprint for the particular molecule or the particular dye or organic compound that you are analyzing. And here we go back to our dear Rothko and to our dear Pollock we started with. When Jane Martin, of course, additional, I'm concentrating because Einstein said no number of experiments can prove me right, although he's not very correct in that, but one experiment can prove me wrong. And here, this experiment on Rothko indicates basically that he used a water-based vinyl acetate as a base, which he never used, and that it was indicated by the infrared, which ruled it as a forgery. As have this particular Pollock, James Martin analyzed 24 paintings. 10 of them had this red pigment, which is a diketopyrrolopyrrole, which is an organic compound, and which is called Ferrari red, because it was used in Ferraris. And in fact, James Martin exclaimed that when he saw in 10 paintings this, he said that was the aha moment, and that these are forgeries. And so this definitely, thanks to infrared, FTIR, it was ruled as a forgery. Now, sometimes you need to have an underlayer, which is actually analyzed, and here is a cross-section that is normally obtained. Now, how this is done? A small amount of sample is taken, embedded in a polyether resin, and then through grinding and polishing, you get several layers, and this allows, through scanning the surface and X-ray fluorescence, to analyze underlayers. And this technique played an important role, as we will see. But before talking about this important role, I want to tell you a very important use of this cross-section analysis in the following slide. Now, sometimes a painter has the technique, the style, is to do a layer, and then the painter doesn't wait for the underlayer and then to dry, and then adds another layer, and so on. Another artist has the habit of having a layer of paint, and then waiting, and then drying, and so on. And therefore, by cross-section analysis, we can get to know whether the layer is wet on dry, because if you look here, the lines are very separated, clearly separated, indicating that the artist waited till the first layer dried, and then added another layer, etc. And this sometimes is not the style of a particular artist if you compare other cross-section, and therefore you detect a forgery, or it might be, which is a confirmation, or you can check whether a signature has been added later or before. But if it's wet on wet, if you look here, there is basically no clear demarcation, and the layers merged against each other. Now, looking at these cross-sections, I'm going to talk about a very unusual forger. I don't know if some of you have heard about Wolfgang Beltracchi. He was a German, very clever at producing the perfect actual forgery. In fact, a term which was coined by my late husband John was he produced his forgeries with Mozartian perfection. And in that case, Beltracchi, after he was caught, of course, and interviewed, he said, I would go to the house of the painter. I would see how the painter lives. I would go to all the galleries. I would try to penetrate the soul and fill arrogantly, you say, the gap in the life of such a particular painter. And he also was as creative in producing his forgeries as he was in the provenance, because he invented a collection. He called it the Jäger collection. And he said it was a collection of Werner Jäger, a businessman in Cologne. And Werner had bought this particular collection from Alfred Leichmann, who was a Jew who escaped the Nazis in 1933 to Paris and sold all this. But what helped him in his story was that two of his accomplices, his wife and her sister, were the actual granddaughters of this Jäger who existed, but he never had a collection. And he went so far as concocting this fictitious picture, where his wife is posing as her grandmother, and with all the forgeries in the background. Now, comes a time where you can make a mistake. And he sold this Campendong, and normally it should pass because he knew the palette of the artist, he knew the same pigments and everything, but he didn't know that the zinc oxide that he bought for a white pigment was slightly adulterated with titanium dioxide, which was modern. And so, by scanning and analyzing an underlayer, Nicolas Istov, I visited his lab, very impressive lab, who analyzed this underlayer, which could not be attributed to retouch, by scanning electron and X-ray fluorescence, and found titanium dioxide. And so he was actually caught in the cross-section analysis. We move now further to another technique which is quite important. It complements the infrared spectroscopy. It's used for organic. It depends on the vibration, but it gives complementary information, and also it gives a fingerprint. And the technique is quite a simple one. You have a laser beam, generally in the visible region of the spectrum. It normally comes and goes to the microscope, and you can analyze a sample 1 micrometer in size. And what happens is that part of the laser beam is reflected, transmitted, and part of it is scattered. But you have two ways of scattering, either elastic scattering, which is most of it, which the wavelength is the same, or inelastic scattering. And this inelastic scattering translates in a spectrum which acts as a fingerprint in comparison to other spectra that are actually obtained. And there's a very interesting story related to this particular Raman. And that is the story of this painting. Now, Martin Lang, who was a businessman and a collector, was enamored with Marc Chagall, the French-Russian painter, and he bought this from a Russian dealer, and he actually was convinced that it was authentic, and was very happy. But then he decided, why don't I take it to Fake and Fortune? You know Fake and Fortune? Fiona Bruce, Bender Grosvenor, and Philip Mould. They took the painting, and of course, in due diligence, they gave it to a forensic scientist, the expert in Raman microscopy. The expert was Robin Clark. And Robin Clark, actually, the late Robin Clark, I knew him, and I asked him about this particular case, as I was quite interested. And he said, you know, the painting came to us. We analyzed it by Raman, and we found two anachronistic pigments, one blue and one green. But what is very intriguing is that Martin Lang was in the room outside, and when we told him the painting is a forgery, he teared up. But then he decided, he said to be very surprised, to send it to Paris to be analyzed and looked at by the Chagall committee held by the grandchildren of Chagall. As Michael Daly, quoting Robin Clark, said, you know, they received the report from Robin Clark saying that it was a forgery, two pigments. They had no choice but to say it's a forgery. But what the Fake and Fortune group and Martin Lang did not know, that according to French law, if a painting belonging to a known artist is actually discovered to be a forgery, it has to be destroyed in front of a magistrate. And so that was the end of this painting. Because a case before, there was a court case, and they actually, so the Raman spectrum, Martin Lang said, I want back my painting, it was too late. Now, we move to a few more authentication, which are now not the traditional technique, as you all heard about cyclotron. Now, a cyclotron is nothing else but, A cyclotron is nothing else but a vacuated tube where electrons are accelerated at an extremely high velocity, close to the velocity of light, and the bending comes from magnets, and the X-ray that is normally obtained has a much higher resolution than normal X-rays. And so doing an X-ray radiography would give a much better picture than that would be obtained by the conventional, traditional X-ray radiography. And here we have this other story of a very nice authentication. Because if you look at this painting was belonging to the Kröller-Müller and belongs still museum. It was signed by Van Gogh. But the connoisseurs, and you see, even if science comes, is a bit shaky, the connoisseur plays an important role. And connoisseurs here said, Van Gogh never painted such large paintings. He never signed in that position. He never actually painted so many flowers. But then, here where art historical evidence comes into play. Because Van Gogh, as we all know, spent his time writing letters. He wrote 930 letters, 650 of these were sent to his brother Theo. And in one of them, in one of the letters, he wrote the following. He wrote, this week I painted a large thing with two nude torsos, two wrestlers. Now, why wasn't it discovered before? The reason was that the Kröller-Müller Museum had done the X-ray, the normal, and it gave a very blurred picture. But when synchrotron, now this much more sophisticated technique was applied, these actually appeared, and the Kröller-Müller is delighted to have a new Van Gogh in its position. Lucky. Now, the mass spectrometer is also a very important technique, which is used in conjunction with many other techniques. Its principle is very simple. You have does it light anymore? Oh, yes, it does. Here you have the sample is injected. It's ionized by an electron source. The ions are accelerated by an electric field. They're bent by a magnetic field, and the lighter are bent more than the heavier. And on the basis of mass, and here it measures mass over energy, over charge. In this case, what we actually obtain is a mass spectrum compared to other is used for identification. Now, more complicated technique, and very up-to-date, is the laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. Bit long as a title, but easily understood. And this technique basically consists of the following. What we have here is the laser beam ablates a minute amount into an aerosol. This minute amount is carried here by helium in a plasma, very highly heated plasma, and the ions that are produced are taken by the mass spectrometer and are identified. Now, the importance of this technique is that it can analyze isotopes. What are isotopes? Isotopes are elements having exactly the same number of protons, so they're all the same, but different number of neutrons, and therefore their mass is different. You can have radioactive isotopes, and you can have stable isotopes, and they differ in mass, and by this sophisticated technique, they can be separated. And we will see that because of the existence of this more specialized technique, another authentication could have been made, or was made. And that is that of St. Praxedis. Now, St. Praxedis is a 2nd century saint. You see her here. She is actually pressing a cloth full of blood of a Christian martyr. And it was always thought to be a painting of Felice Ficirelli, because he had painted another one, and they assumed that this one was really Felice's work. Until Michael Kitson, the art historian, looked at it and saw a signature. He said it looked very much like a work of Vermeer made asleep. So why don't we analyze it a bit closer? Nobody answered. But in 1986, again, Alfred Wico, another actual, another art historian, looked and said, the face looks very much like a maid asleep, and also Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. So why don't we analyze it? And they analyzed everything about it, except one thing. They had to prove that it was formed in Holland and not in Italy, because Felice Ficirelli would have made it in Italy. Now, how do we do this? By lead isotope. And how is this actually carried out? Let me explain a bit more. Oh, Jehane. What are you doing? An experiment was actually done by Giuseppe Fertinado. Now, lead carbonate is a white pigment. And this white pigment has predominantly lead. And lead has 4 isotopes. Isotope 204, which is stable. Isotope 206, 207, and 208 that are radioactive. And they are radioactive because they result from the decomposition of uranium-235, 238, and thorium-232. And therefore, they decompose, and depending on the origin of the lead itself, the ore, you would have different ratios. And what Giuseppe, and in fact I met Giuseppe also at a conference, he actually did this experiment where he analyzed a number of paintings, some of Italian origin, some of Dutch origin, and he actually looked at, he plotted the ratio of lead 207 over 204 and 206 over 204, and he obtained this particular graph. Now, if you look, the gray part are all Italian, the Dutch part all red. And when they analyzed, actually, the lead isotopes with laser ablation, inductive mass spectrometry, they actually found it in the red which confirmed that this painting had a Dutch origin, and it was indeed not formed by Ficciarelli, but it was an authentic Vermeer. So here is a victory of an authentication, and Einstein was not totally right by saying no number of experiments can prove me right, because here we proved that this was actually the case. So now we move further, and here you probably all know this man, Van Meegeren. Now here I'd like to quote Enrico Fermi in a very nice quote, because he said, "Never underestimate the pleasure that people derive in hearing the things they already know." So probably you're going to be very happy listening again quite rapidly at the story of Van Meegeren. Now, Van Meegeren, it is said, and he claimed that he was bitter at the art world, that they didn't understand anything about his art, and that he was going to avenge himself, and he made actually a plot to actually fool the greatest art critic of the time. Now, Bredius, who was at the time the greatest art critic present, had predicted that there would be some more Vermeer, that they would have an Italian connotations, that they would have religious significance, the style also would be a bit Italian influenced, and that they would be very large in size. So he said, I'm going to do something to satisfy his predictions. But what he had to do, basically, was also to find a way at producing a wonderful craquelure. He experimented 4 years, and he worked very secretly. In fact, you notice in some of his forgery that the faces look like Greta Garbo, the famous actress. You see, actress play a role here too. And he experimented for 4 years, and the problem was that the way he managed to get a very good craquelure was to use the oil of lilac, pigments in oil of lilac, that he added to formaldehyde and benzene. But he had a problem, because nobody could go to his lab. He had to find faces he had to copy, and the smell of the oil of lilac would actually, people would wonder, why is the lab reeking of that smell? And so he took a liking to the flowers and always had lilacs in his lab. Now, his first and most important forgery was this particular Emmaus that was called, and he met all the predictions of Bredius. Large painting, very much like Caravaggio, Italian influence, religious connotation, etc. So when, through an intermediate, Bredius saw it, he said, wonderful. My predictions are correct. And in fact, this is the masterpiece of Vermeer. And in fact, this is what Meegeren recounted after that. He was waiting in order to show that the critics did not understand anything. Of course, once it was sold for a few $1 million, he was very happy to keep the money and to start forging some more paintings. And one of his forgeries was this painting entitled The Woman Taken in Adultery, which was sold to Field Marshal Goering, who was very close to Hitler. And at the end, in 1944 of the Second World War, the Dutch government had said anybody who collaborated with the Nazi would have the death penalty. And here you see a desperate Van Meegeren holding his head, because it's be lost soon. But he told them, I didn't. I actually fooled the Nazis, and I didn't produce a forgery. And I didn't produce an authentic painting. I produced a forgery. Of course, nobody actually believed him. He said, yes, I forged it, and I obtained against it 200 Dutch paintings that were returned to the Dutch government. And to prove it, let me paint you another. So They locked him up, not like me. And he painted young Christ very much in the Vermeer style. He got only 1 year in prison, a sentence for prison for signing for falsifying a signature, and that was a sentence he never fulfilled because he died right away. So that's the end of Van Meegeren, but we will see that had it been today, and with the forensic scientists, we would have seen the expensive ultramarine that he got was slightly adulterated with cobalt blue, that the craquelure did not match the craquelure in the canvas, etc., and the whole thing would have been unraveled. Now, having said that, we will move to something else, which I am interested to share with you, because the general consensus is that what motivates forgers is the fact that forgers want to get back at the art world, each one, after being caught, says so, and with a different version, a variation on a theme, but that really, if we look at the following statement by Maurice Gauthier, who was a criminologist and who wrote an important article, and what he said was, it seems that the art of forgery is motivated not by secondary gains or weak conscience, but by inner conflicts that demand relief from tension. The act of forgery serves as an attempt to solve emotional conflicts. And this is in keeping also, because forgers lie also, by Charles Ford, who said, lies, lies, the psychology of deceit, where compulsive lying is a coping mechanism that helps in alleviating. And as we will see now, with each one of the forgers, and I will go relatively quick, I don't know how much time because I can't see time. Van Meegeren, basically, number one, is described by Jonathan Lopez, his biographer, as a crook and a sociopath, a far cry from the Dutch hero made from the Dutch government. And he claims that Van Meegeren, who claimed that I'm getting back at the art world because they don't understand anything and they didn't understand anything in my art, he claims that when Van Meegeren was very young, he actually painted the interior of a church. He won in the School of Delft first prize, and when he sold it to a buyer, a second buyer showed up. So he made a copy and he wanted to sell it as the original. Now here, there's absolutely nothing going in the art world since he had won a first prize. If we look at Elmire de Hory, Elmire said the art world when he was caught. They're all when they're caught, but not before. The art world doesn't understand anything. They take very cheaply my paintings, then they sell them for a big price. And Mark Foggy, with whom I corresponded, actually wrote in his memoirs that Elmire lied to Clifford Irving, his biographer, when he pretended that his father was an Austro-Hungarian ambassador, that his mother was from a family of bankers, and that at the same time, the father from the archives of Jewish families obtained in Budapest, his father was a wholesale vendor of second-handed crafts, and his mother was a Holocaust survivor. He lied also by changing his name. De Hory sounds aristocratic, so he falsified and lied, he falsified his certificate. So again, we see something in keeping with what these psychologists are saying. If we look at Eric Hebben also escaped from school, tried to burn his school, was beaten throughout his life by his mother. And again, his partner, Graham Smith, wrote about him that he again had a lot of emotional problems. And Eric Hebben claimed when he was caught, he was not caught actually, but when he wrote his own biography, he said that he was assassinated at the end. In fact, he wrote that he actually wanted to fool these pseudo-experts who looked at his forgeries and said they were authentic. Finally, Beltracchi also when he was interviewed as speaker after he was caught, said, if you look into my brain, you'd find something very different. Emotionally, he was also, at the same time, a man who would wear long fur coats, hair till waist, and having photographs all around. So there is something really in Beltracchi which is not emotionally what it should be by our normal standards, I hope. Now, if we move on and look at fraud analysts, Marta explains. She says, regardless of the type of fraud, most offenders seem to seek to justify and rationalize their activity. And Peter Grabowski, who was also written on criminal, he says, forgers will use vocabularies of adjustment that manufacture rationale and extenuating circumstances and remove the perception of criminality. And therefore, the chief motivation, in my viewpoint, is not really getting back at the artwork, but is really a demand for a relief from tension. Now you're going to tell me, but forgers also want money. Not everybody does forgery, and there must be something in the emotional makeup of the individual to engage, and since they're good painters, they move to fooling the world. Now, one last thing. You have a painting, you think it's a Monet, like poor Domenico di Sol. Domenico di Sol had his beautiful, here they're looking all at the emails, the view is changing because it's a forgery. But if you had a painting and you were told it's a Sisley, it's a Modigliani, it's a Corot, you're very happy to have it in the best place in your home. But if you know that it's a forgery, if you have this mentality, you would remove it and put it somewhere else in a less important. And this is generally when we look at a painting and realize it is not the authentic, we look at it differently. Now, how is this explained? Some people say it's snobbery. Others say, like Paul Bloom, that it's a question of belief. If you believe in something, you get pleasure from such a belief. But when the belief is lost, therefore, the picture loses its hold on you. Others say, well, it's the creativity, which is quite true. That if you have a painting, but it's not discovering it's a forgery, but if you have a painting in the style of a Turner, it would not make an effect on you as would a Turner at his time, because the creativity and the originality is not there anymore. But what is interesting here is an experiment which was done at Oxford University, co-joining Martin Kemp, the famous art historian on Leonardo, and Andrew Parker, physiologist, with some co-workers. And that is with the rise of cognitive science. What really was done was that they got 14 participants in the experiment. They knew who Rembrandt was, but they were not experts in Rembrandt. And they told them, this is an authentic painting. And they did the scan. And then they uncovered that it was a forgery. And they did the scan of the brain again. And what they discovered was astonishing, because different parts of the brain were activated depending on whether one was looking at the forgery or at an authentic painting. And the conclusion was, in fact, the frontal polar cortex and the occipital was done when they announced that it was authentic, whereas the francopolar with the precuneus, which is there, the site of deceit and thinking, was actually activated when it was a forgery. And it's as if all the neurons in the brain changed their path and decided at the revelation that the brain did not act, as Martin Kemp say, in a rational manner. So this is one particular interpretation that we can take maybe with a grain of salt. Now, going back to science, finally, when can science give a concluding verdict on forgery. You probably all know by now that when it acts as a tool for falsification, all right? When when you have a technique which, as we saw, unveils that it is a forgery. When do we have authentication? When there's a consensus in the world of connoisseurship with actually the approval of science. And in this case, for instance, we have a Rembrandt, which was recently authenticated at the Hamilton Kerr, because the main connoisseur on Rembrandt, who died now, said it was probably if the science is correct. But if the connoisseurs say no, then that's a problem there. Or when there is an art historical evidence, as in the case of Van Gogh, with the collaboration of science, or there is an ironclad provenance, sometimes it fools either case. And here, really, we have a synergy of all these together. Now, I will make a reflective conclusion to my talk and read the following. Said by Helmut Höllmer, problems in the market occur when we forget why art is created in the first place. When money is turned into art, that is one thing. But when art is translated into money, it's a problematic transaction. And maybe I can add a bit of morality there. It is hoped that a day will come when forgeries are significantly reduced and the art market's complicity in the face of self-interest is overcome. Each instance of fraud and deceit that is combated brings us closer to a world where ethics, probably applied knowledge, and honor prevail. Thank you.